At 20:17 a.m., Eleanor Voss discovered something no algorithm could predict. Her sons had erased themselves from her system. Every security camera in her penthouse had a 3-minute blind spot. Every device was left behind. Every digital trail ended deliberately. Atlas and Rowan Voss, 12 years old, had executed a cleaner disappearance than most cybercriminals she had prosecuted. On her kitchen counter sat a handwritten note, not asking for forgiveness, not asking for permission, telling her they were going to fix something she refused to see. Eleanor had built an empire controlling global data networks, political contracts, and billion-dollar acquisitions. But that night, she realized something terrifying. She could monitor the world. She just couldn't control her own sons. And wherever they were going, it was connected to her company. Eleanor Voss stood 42 floors above Manhattan, watching the city behave exactly as she expected it to. Traffic obeyed signals. Markets opened and closed on schedule. Digital tickers streamed predictable patterns across the transparent wall screens inside her penthouse office. She had built her empire on the belief that systems worked when people did not. As the founder of Voss Dynamics, she had turned a modest cybersecurity startup into one of the most dominant data infrastructure corporations in the United States. Analysts described her as untouchable, disciplined, a strategist who anticipated global shifts before they formed. She preferred another word, prepared. Her public image was engineered with the same precision as her software architecture. Interviews were measured. Statements were intentional. Appearances were rare and controlled. She did not improvise. She optimized. Investors trusted her because she removed uncertainty. Competitors feared her because she studied them longer than they studied themselves. The market moved when she signaled. Inside her private residence, however, the architecture of control extended beyond business. The penthouse operated on silent automation, climate adjusted to biometric readings. Security systems tracked every entry point. Digital dashboards monitored schedules down to 5-minute increments. Contracts were reviewed at the dining table. Efficiency was not a professional standard, it was her oxygen. The glass walls overlooking Manhattan were not designed for beauty alone. They reminded her how far she had climbed. They also reflected her back to herself, alone in a skyline of millions. Her obsession with order had roots deeper than profit margins. Eleanor grew up in a house where volatility replaced stability. Her father was charismatic and brilliant, but reckless with money and promises. Opportunities were chased. Bills were ignored. Evictions came without warning. She learned early that chaos humiliated. Chaos stripped dignity. On the night creditors cleared their living room, she made a quiet vow control would equal safety. Systems would prevent loss. Precision would eliminate pain. That belief carried her forward. It built her company. It shaped her parenting. Atlas and Rowan Voss, 12-year-old twins, lived within the carefully calibrated world she constructed. Atlas was observant, methodical, often studying people the way his mother studied markets. Rowan carried a sharper emotional awareness, sensing tension before it surfaced. They attended Blackridge Academy, an elite boarding institution chosen for its discipline and legacy pipeline. Their schedules were structured, their tutors selected, their futures mapped. Yet small disruptions had begun surfacing. Teachers' reports hinted at resistance, independent thinking framed as defiance. Projects completed brilliantly but unconventionally, missed compliance signatures, subtle refusals to participate in ceremonies they deemed unnecessary. The boys did not argue, they simply detached. Eleanor could control governments through contracts, influence narratives through strategic donations, and suppress hostile press cycles before sunrise. But at her own dinner table, silence lingered longer than it should. Atlas and Rowan answered questions efficiently, not warmly. Their eyes held thought, not surrender. Late one evening, as city lights shimmered against the glass walls, a notification interrupted her screen. A priority message from Blackridge Academy waited in her inbox. Formal language. Immediate attention required. An incident involving both boys. Eleanor did not fear financial downturns. She feared disorder. And as she opened the letter, she sensed something had moved beyond correction. The school required her presence in person. What her sons had done, the message implied, could not be handled remotely. Blackridge Academy stood on a stretch of manicured Connecticut land where tradition mattered more than innovation and legacy carried more weight than truth. The stone buildings were older than most corporations. Their halls lined with portraits of senators, CEOs, and federal judges who once wore the same navy blazers now issued to Atlas and Rowan Voss. Eleanor had chosen Blackridge with precision. Discipline, prestige, influence, this was the environment where future leaders were shaped, not questioned. When her car passed through the iron gates, she expected a contained issue. A minor infraction, a behavioral lapse, something correctable with authority and a signed agreement. The headmaster greeted her with restrained politeness, but beneath his composure lingered something unfamiliar, defensiveness. The explanation unfolded in measured language. Atlas and Rowan had accessed restricted internal files from the Academy's financial system. They had traced a series of discretionary disciplinary actions tied to a major donor's contributions. A student from a non-legacy background had been quietly expelled after reporting misconduct involving that donor's son. The twins had uncovered inconsistencies in scholarship relocations and board voting records. Then they had distributed the findings anonymously across student networks. It had not been impulsive. It had been methodical. They timed the release before a board meeting. They masked their digital trail long enough to ensure the information spread beyond administrative containment. By the time faculty traced the breach, the narrative was already circulating among parents. The headmaster framed it as criminal misconduct. Unauthorized access. Breach of institutional trust. Eleanor listened without interruption, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Yet beneath that stillness something tightened. This was not recklessness, it was strategy, and strategy she understood intimately. The Academy faced reputational risk. Donor withdrawal. Media inquiry. The board wanted the matter silenced quickly. Expulsion was on the table unless Atlas and Rowan issued a formal apology and retraction admitting fabrication. Eleanor's anger did not ignite over ethics. It ignited over exposure. They had acted without her knowledge, outside her structure, beyond her control. She had designed their path carefully, and they had altered it without permission. When she finally met her sons in the administrative office, she studied them the way she studied negotiations. Neither appeared afraid. Atlas observed the room, calculating implications. Rowan held a steadier gaze, calm but unyielding. There was no arrogance in them, only certainty. Further details complicated the narrative. The expelled student's family lacked influence. The donor's financial leverage had shaped the board's decision. Atlas and Rowan had intervened because they believed silence equaled complicity. They had not sought recognition. They had not defended themselves publicly. They simply refused to let the injustice stand. For the first time, Eleanor recognized something unsettling. They did not fear consequences. They evaluated them. The board issued its ultimatum before she left campus. A written apology, full compliance, and digital probation, or immediate removal from Blackridge Academy with permanent record notation. That evening, inside the privacy of the Academy's conference room, Atlas and Rowan declined to apologize. They would not retract verified facts. As Eleanor absorbed their refusal, a colder realization surfaced. Punishment might discipline obedience. But with boys like hers, it might only sharpen resolve. Eleanor Voss withdrew Atlas and Rowan from Blackridge Academy within 48 hours of their refusal to comply. Officially, the decision was framed as strategic redirection. Privately, it was containment. If the institution could not enforce structure, she would. The penthouse that once symbolized achievement quietly transformed into a fortified ecosystem of supervision. Tutors rotated through curated lesson plans aligned with Ivy League benchmarks. Security protocols expanded to include internal access logs, device monitoring, and biometric alerts. Schedules were redesigned down to 15-minute increments. Discipline, she believed, would recalibrate defiance. The boys did not protest. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic refusals. Their resistance evolved into something quieter and far more unsettling. Atlas complied outwardly while analyzing loopholes within her systems. He followed schedules precisely but adjusted interpretations to maximize autonomy within the margins. Rowan, less mechanical but more perceptive, observed her emotional cues, responding with calm detachment instead of confrontation. They did not challenge her authority directly. They rendered it inefficient. Conversations at dinner shifted. Instead of discussing coursework, Atlas began referencing corporate consolidation patterns within emerging tech markets. Rowan asked measured questions about vendor displacement and small firms absorbed by Voss dynamics over the last decade. Their tone remained neutral, but their research was thorough. They had reviewed public filings, investor reports, and regulatory settlements. They were not accusing her. They were evaluating her. For Eleanor, the shift felt personal. She had built Voss dynamics from vulnerability, expanding aggressively to prevent being overtaken. To her, acquisitions represented survival. To her sons, they resembled elimination. The realization unsettled her more than their school rebellion had. They no longer saw her primarily as their mother. They saw her as a system efficient, profitable, and emotionally distant. In response, Eleanor tightened oversight. Devices were restricted. Movement within the building required notification. Tutors reported not only academic progress but behavioral nuances. Control had always restored equilibrium before. This time it created distance. Then came the discovery that disrupted her certainty. A routine security review revealed unexplained absences during approved exercise hours. Further examination uncovered anonymous donations linked to a community learning center in Queens. Atlas and Rowan had been volunteering discreetly, tutoring underfunded students in coding and mathematics. They had used their allowance not for gadgets or status, but for textbooks and refurbished laptops. They never requested acknowledgement. The realization unsettled her far more than public scandal. Their defiance was not rooted in rebellion for its own sake. It was rooted in empathy. They were applying the very skills she had taught them, but in directions she had not authorized. Fearlessness, she began to understand, did not always come from ego. Sometimes it came from conviction. Eleanor had always believed love meant protection through structure. Remove risk, remove chaos, remove unpredictability. Atlas and Rowan operated under a different belief: freedom preserved integrity. They did not reject her success. They rejected confinement. Gradually, she felt a shift in authority. They obeyed rules, but not her logic. Influence without emotional consent began to fracture. Determined to regain stability, Eleanor authorized full-spectrum digital monitoring across every device and internal system. Within hours, she discovered encrypted networks operating beyond her surveillance grid, systems designed not to attack her infrastructure, but to bypass it. Her sons had anticipated her next move. The first article appeared on an anonymous financial blog at 5:12 a.m., timed with market pre-open analysis. It did not accuse, it insinuated. The headline referenced instability inside the Voss household, hinting that internal family conflict had begun influencing corporate decisions. By noon, the post had been amplified across social platforms, reframed by commentators who specialized in attaching spectacle to power. Atlas and Rowan's protest at Blackridge Academy resurfaced with sharper edges, stripped of context and repackaged as evidence of dysfunction. Investors responded with quiet caution. Calls from institutional stakeholders shifted in tone. Analysts who once praised Eleanor's strategic foresight began asking measured questions about leadership distraction. Stability, the currency she had always guaranteed, now carried an asterisk. Voss Dynamics stock dipped modestly, not enough to signal collapse, but enough to suggest hesitation. The narrative evolved quickly. Media panels debated privileged parenting and corporate ethics in the same breath. One segment labeled her the billionaire who could dominate industries, but could not manage her own sons. The phrasing spread because it was simple. It was personal. It was memorable. For the first time in her career, Eleanor felt the sensation of public vulnerability without a countermeasure ready. She had neutralized competitors, regulatory scrutiny, and hostile acquisitions. Yet this criticism did not originate from the marketplace. It emerged from perception. Reputation had become volatile, and perception could not be acquired or merged. Inside the Voss Dynamics boardroom, concern hardened into pressure. Directors emphasized shareholder confidence, brand integrity, optics. They suggested visible corrective action, either public reconciliation with her sons or decisive separation from the narrative. One member proposed relocating Atlas and Rowan to a European preparatory program, distancing them from American media cycles. Another recommended a controlled interview to reshape the story. Eleanor evaluated each suggestion clinically, yet something beneath her composure shifted. Sending her sons abroad would silence speculation, but it would confirm distance. She requested time. That evening, alone in her private office, she opened a rarely accessed digital archive. Photographs filled the screen, Atlas at 7 holding a robotics trophy she had funded but never attended. Rowan at 9 standing in a school auditorium, scanning the audience for a familiar face that had been delayed by a quarterly earnings call. Birthday cakes captured by staff, milestones documented but not witnessed. The realization was not dramatic. It was incremental. Success had required trade-offs. She had accepted them as necessary. But the accumulation of missed moments formed a pattern she had not analyzed. Control had secured their future, yet perhaps it had also distanced their present. Meanwhile, the anonymous blog published a second piece containing internal scheduling data from Voss Dynamics, implying executive instability during the Blackridge incident. That detail was not public. It was proprietary. Eleanor's suspicion sharpened. This was not random commentary. Someone inside her corporation was feeding selective information to shape the narrative. A private internal audit began quietly that night. Access logs were reviewed. Communication trails examined. Patterns surfaced pointing not to a junior employee, but to encrypted transmissions routed through an executive-level clearance. By the end of the week, preliminary findings suggested the leak did not originate from outside adversaries. It originated from within her inner executive circle. The internal audit confirmed what Eleanor had already begun to suspect. The data leak traced back to encrypted financial maneuvers executed during the peak of media volatility. The transactions were subtle, layered across offshore accounts, and timed alongside fluctuations in Voss Dynamics stock. At the center of the pattern stood Harrison Vale, her chief financial officer for nearly a decade, a man she had once described as indispensable. Vale had positioned short-term derivatives against temporary stock declines triggered by the public scandal. As headlines questioned her leadership and investors hesitated, he quietly capitalized on the instability. The anonymous blog posts were not reckless gossip, they were calibrated accelerants. Each release aligned with trades that benefited from downward pressure before strategic rebounds. He had not attacked her directly. He had manipulated perception, knowing she would focus on external optics while he harvested profit from internal trimmers. Eleanor reviewed the financial models late into the night, her composure intact but her certainty fractured. She had built safeguards against competitors, regulatory audits, and market sabotage. Yet she had overlooked the vulnerability created by proximity. Her fixation on controlling narratives at home and in public had blinded her to loyalty within her executive circle. She had trusted systems more than instincts, spreadsheets more than people. The discovery, however, did not originate from her internal compliance team. It came from Atlas and Rowan. While confined within her monitoring protocols, they had continued examining open, market activity tied to Voss Dynamics. Atlas identified irregular trading windows that mirrored media spikes. Rowan traced shell corporations back to advisory committees linked to Vale. They compiled evidence quietly, assembling patterns without accusation. When they presented the information to their mother, it was not with triumph but with clarity. The reversal unsettled her. They were not undermining her authority. They were protecting it. Their analysis lacked ego, driven instead by principle. They had acted to shield the company not because it was hers, but because it affected employees, investors, and communities connected to its stability. In that moment, Eleanor recognized courage unmotivated by control. Legal counsel moved swiftly once the evidence was validated. Federal regulators were notified discreetly. Vale's access privileges were suspended under the guise of procedural review. The confrontation unfolded within boardroom walls rather than public spectacle. Eleanor remained composed, presenting data rather than emotion. The betrayal was handled through contracts, investigations, and eventual indictment proceedings. No dramatic accusations were necessary, the numbers spoke. Yet beneath the procedural efficiency, something shifted internally. If her sons could act decisively without dominating, perhaps strength did not require rigidity. Perhaps influence did not require isolation. The thought unsettled her more than Vale's deception had. As federal investigators prepared to arrive at Voss headquarters to formalize inquiries, Eleanor returned home expecting tension but finding silence. Atlas and Rowan were not in their scheduled study session. Their devices rested neatly on the kitchen counter, location services disabled. Security logs showed a deliberate exit during a routine maintenance window. On the same night her corporation faced federal scrutiny, her sons had vanished, control had always steadied Eleanor Voss. It regulated her pulse, clarified her thinking, reduced risk to measurable variables. But as she stood in the center of her silent penthouse and realized Atlas and Rowan were gone, control did not arrive. Panic did. It was unfamiliar and unfiltered, moving through her with a force she could neither quantify nor suppress. She accessed the security grid immediately. Camera feeds replayed in synchronized frames across the glass wall displays. Every corridor elevator, an exit point streamed in precise timestamps. At first glance, nothing appeared abnormal. Then she saw it, 3-minute gaps in 2 hallway cameras, a routine system update that had been manually initiated from an internal console. Not a malfunction. A decision her sons had not run impulsively. They had engineered absence. She scanned for forced exits, emergency overrides, digital anomalies. There were none. The doors opened with proper authorization. The maintenance window had been scheduled earlier that week under her own approval queue. Atlas must have calculated the timing. Rowan must have known exactly how long emotional distraction would delay detection. On the kitchen island, beneath the soft light she preferred for evening briefings, lay a single sheet of paper. Handwritten, not encrypted, not hidden. The message was concise, deliberate, and restrained. It did not accuse. It did not plead. It expressed disappointment, not in discipline, but in silence. They believed something connected to Voss Dynamics was causing harm beyond financial displacement. They intended to verify it themselves because waiting for board reviews meant waiting too long. The note did not threaten rebellion. It revealed conviction. Eleanor felt the fracture inside her widen. Federal investigators were scheduled to arrive at headquarters by morning to formalize proceedings against Harrison Vale. Media attention hovered close. The board expected her presence. Her company required stability at the most visible moment of vulnerability. Yet her sons were pursuing something that intersected with her own signed contracts. For the first time in her career, she withdrew from corporate command without layered contingency. She informed the board she would not attend the federal briefing in person. She authorized legal teams to proceed autonomously. It was an uncharacteristic delegation driven not by efficiency, but by urgency. Without a prepared strategy, she traced the fragmented clues left within the boy's note, references to a regional logistics partner recently acquired through a subsidiary agreement. Public filings indicated compliance. However, Rowan had underlined a location, a distribution facility in a lower-income industrial corridor outside the city. Driving herself rather than summoning security detail, Eleanor felt the unfamiliar weight of acting without modeling outcomes. Streetlights blurred past as she replayed overlooked documents in her mind. Growth projections. Vendor audits. Environmental assessments summarized in optimistic language she had accepted without scrutiny. When she reached the industrial district, the building stood dim beneath sodium lights, its signage partially removed. The parking lot was nearly empty. The facility's name matched the subsidiary contract she had signed 18 months earlier. Eleanor stepped out of the car and looked at the darkened structure connected directly to her expansion strategy. Somewhere inside, her sons believed they were correcting her oversight. The facility doors were unlocked, not abandoned but operating in partial silence. Inside, the air carried the sterile efficiency of outsourced logistics, yet the surrounding neighborhood told a different story. Eleanor had reviewed expansion reports that praised job creation and streamlined distribution metrics. What she had not examined closely were the secondary effects: waste runoff complaints filed quietly by residents, unresolved labor grievances redirected through subcontractors, and zoning exemptions granted under economic pressure. Growth had been documented in quarterly returns, not in lived consequences. Atlas and Rowan stood near a temporary operations office at the rear of the warehouse, their posture steady, not startled by her arrival. They had not come recklessly, they had come prepared. They had compiled environmental citations, archived local news segments, and recorded testimony from community members who felt overshadowed by corporate scale. They did not request rescue. They requested acknowledgement. When Eleanor urged them to leave with her, they refused, not out of defiance but principle. They would not disengage unless she recognized publicly that Voss Dynamics had expanded without sufficient ethical oversight. They were not asking her to dismantle her empire. They were asking her to see it fully. The demand cut deeper than accusation. It required surrender, not of assets, but of narrative control. By morning, Eleanor stood before cameras outside the facility rather than at headquarters beside federal investigators. The press had already connected her presence to the subsidiary partner under scrutiny. She did not offer evasive language. She acknowledged that rapid expansion had prioritized efficiency over localized accountability. She admitted that oversight mechanisms failed to detect the cumulative harm emerging in communities with limited leverage. The statement was precise and unscripted. Markets responded immediately. Voss Dynamics stock dropped sharply within hours, accelerated by headlines framing her remarks as corporate confession. Analysts debated leadership stability. Shareholders expressed alarm. Commentators labeled it a rare public concession from a figure long associated with strategic dominance. Inside the warehouse, Atlas and Rowan listened without celebration. Their objective had never been spectacle. It had been integrity. Eleanor initiated contract termination clauses with the logistics partner pending comprehensive review. She authorized independent environmental audits and established restitution funds without negotiation leverage. Advisors cautioned restraint. She declined. For the first time, she made decisions unshielded by layered contingencies. Truth replaced preservation. In a quiet moment away from cameras, she stepped toward her sons and lowered herself to their eye level. It was not theatrical. It was not apology for success. It was recognition that control had limited her field of vision. She understood now that leadership without humility calcified into isolation. By kneeling, she relinquished the illusion that authority required distance. She did not feel weakened. She felt exposed and unexpectedly steadier. The following week, the Voss Dynamics board convened an emergency session. Stock volatility, federal investigations, and unilateral executive decisions had unsettled investor confidence. Eleanor entered the meeting aware that surrendering narrative control carried consequence. By majority vote, the board moved to remove her as chief executive officer pending restructuring. The empire she built had survived market crashes and hostile takeovers. Now it stood without her at the helm. Eleanor Voss resigned from Voss Dynamics without contesting the board's decision. The announcement was formal, restrained, and framed as transitional restructuring. Financial losses followed, not catastrophic but undeniable. Stock value stabilized at a lower plateau, investors recalibrated expectations, and analysts revised long-term projections with cautious neutrality. The empire she built no longer moved at her command, yet it did not collapse. It adjusted, as markets always do. Public perception divided along predictable lines. Some viewed her admission of corporate negligence as rare integrity in a landscape accustomed to deflection. Others interpreted it as evidence of weakened leadership. Opinion pieces debated whether empathy belonged in executive offices. Eleanor did not participate in the discourse. For the first time in decades, she allowed narrative to unfold without interference. Atlas and Rowan enrolled in a smaller academic institution in Manhattan, one known less for legacy pipelines and more for civic engagement. This time, Eleanor attended orientation in person. She reviewed syllabi not to enforce outcomes but to understand interests. Structure remained present in their lives, yet it no longer suffocated autonomy. The difference was subtle but transformative. The Voss Foundation, once a strategic philanthropic extension of corporate branding, underwent quiet reconstruction. Eleanor redirected its mission toward ethical innovation grants, environmental accountability programs, and community-led technology incubators. Funding approvals required independent oversight panels. She positioned herself not as architect but as sponsor. Influence shifted from command to collaboration. Evenings inside the penthouse changed in ways that financial reports could not measure. One night, dinner extended beyond its scheduled window because no schedule had been set. Atlas described a robotics prototype designed for public school distribution. Rowan analyzed urban policy proposals he believed underestimated youth agency. Eleanor listened without correcting their frameworks. Silence at the table transformed from distance into contemplation. Gradually, she recognized the misbelief that had shaped her ascent. Control had promised safety because chaos once humiliated her family. Yet control had also narrowed her emotional field, reducing unpredictability at the cost of connection. Safety, she understood now, did not emerge from surveillance or dominance. It emerged from trust strong enough to withstand uncertainty. Bitterness lingered at times. She had relinquished a title that defined her adult life. The skyline no longer reflected authority back at her. Yet something steadier replaced it. Atlas and Rowan no longer evaluated her as a system. They engaged her as a person. Months later, a community technology center opened in the same industrial corridor, once linked to negligent oversight. There was no corporate banner bearing her name, only a modest plaque acknowledging foundation support. Children filled the renovated space, testing equipment funded by redirected capital. Eleanor stood at ground level rather than above it, observing without orchestrating. Years passed with quieter rhythms. Atlas and Rowan, older and increasingly independent, began drafting plans for a venture of their own, one blending innovation with accountability from inception. Eleanor reviewed their proposals only when invited. She offered insight without imposition. As she watched them prepare to build something unbound by her control, she made a choice that once would have felt impossible. She chose not to interfere. If this story made you pause, if it made you think about the choices that shape a family long after success is achieved, then stay with this channel. Stories like this are not just about wealth or power. They are about the quiet moments that define who we become when control slips away. Share this with someone who understands that success means nothing without connection. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you already know what to do. She built an empire trying to control the future, but in the end, she had to release control to save what mattered most. So tell me this, if the people you love challenged everything you built, would you defend your success, or would you risk losing it to protect your relationship with them? I'd really like to know what you would choose.